Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Vela, and I am the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Southeast area of the state. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified American with Disabilities Act coordinator. Today's presentation on the game plan is the sixth in the Accessible Ohio Playbook six-part webinar series. Presenting alongside me today is my colleague, Shelly. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Shelly Burkhart, and I'm the Northwest Accessible Ohio Specialist and a Certified Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. We plan for accessibility from the start. We use the Accessibility Checker, which is built into Microsoft 365, to review the resource guide and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text known as alt text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Tanya, can you give the attendees an overview of our webinar series?
Absolutely. The Accessible Ohio Playbook six-part webinar series started with the fundamentals, which described three main considerations when designing and enhancing the accessibility and inclusion of all environments. These include the Accessible Ohio priorities, the American with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, and universal design. The second session on planning and awareness included best practices for creating accessible websites, ideas for communicating the accessibility features an organization offers, and strategies to train customer-facing staff on disability awareness and accessibility. The playbook continued with the second priority, navigation. This webinar shared best practices for arriving, entering, and moving throughout a space. The fourth session shared our third priority, experience, which provided information about common accessibility tools and practices and reasonable accommodations and modifications. The fifth session discussed our final priority, personal care. This webinar shared information on ways to make spaces dedicated to personal needs accessible, including restrooms, universal changing stations, sensory spaces, and service animal relief areas. Each of these sessions included technical guidance for accessibility and best practices for applying universal design to create inclusive cultures, environments, and experiences. The final session of the Accessible Playbook is called the Game Plan and addresses how to establish and prioritize goals for accessibility and inclusion, and then create a plan for achieving these goals. Throughout the webinar, we'll explain how Accessible Ohio can connect our partners with best practices for accessibility and inclusivity. Shelly, let's get things started with a brief overview of Accessible Ohio.
Sure. Accessible Ohio specialists partner with employers, businesses, communities, venues, and attractions to help identify barriers, establish goals for accessibility, connect with resources for accessibility enhancements, and provide information about potential funding sources. Our team's mission is to prioritize accessibility from the start, promote inclusiveness, and ensure everyone can experience Ohio in an equitable way. We strive to move beyond the minimum guidelines of the ADA and focus on universal design, both of which are addressed throughout this webinar series. Accessible Ohio specialists provide consultations, education, and resources.
Shelly, because accessibility touches everything we do, We like to describe it as a journey we are all on to help Accessible Ohio partners prioritize where to start and plan their next steps. We've organized accessibility into three main fundamentals. This begins with our Accessible Ohio priorities. Next, we continue with guidance from the ADA, and to a larger extent, the concepts included with universal design. This webinar focuses specifically on the game plan, which is an action plan our partners can use to determine how to move forward with achieving their accessibility and inclusion goals. Shelly, let's kick things off by discussing Accessible Ohio's 4 priorities.
Sounds good. Accessible Ohio has identified 4 priorities that span the arc of accessibility. The first priority is planning and awareness. This involves the ways entities plan for accessibility and inclusion. It also includes the activities a person may participate in when learning about or planning a visit. Some examples include making a website accessible, organizing accessibility services and features on a web page, providing social narratives, and training staff on disability etiquette and awareness and the accessibility features the venue offers. The second priority is navigation. Navigation considers ways individuals arrive at, enter, and navigate an environment. Examples include accessible signage, accessibility maps, motorized wheelchair and scooter charging stations, and wayfinding. The third priority is experience, which creates environments where everyone can participate in what they came to do or enjoy. Some examples include sensory-friendly experiences, live captioning, and accessible seating. The fourth priority is personal care. This encompasses the spaces and resources provided for individuals to care for their personal needs when enjoying their communities and public areas. Examples of this include accessible restrooms, universal changing stations, accessible drinking fountains, sensory spaces, and service animal relief areas. Okay, let's share an overview of accessible design.
Great idea, Shelly. Accessible design is informed by the ADA. This civil rights law makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all facets of public life. It covers areas of work such as the hiring process and employment, and aspects of public life, such as accessing goods at a store or going to the zoo. It also covers state and local government programs, activities, and services such as summer camps offered by a public school. The 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, which we refer to as the standards, were created by the Department of Justice as a resource for entities with responsibilities under the ADA. It provides minimum guidelines for making sites, buildings, facilities, and elements accessible for public use. The standards and the ADA work together to provide guidance toward removing barriers and providing equal access to individuals with disabilities.
Tanya, we also consider universal design. Universal design is focused on moving beyond the minimum guidelines to create an environment that can be accessed by all. This is also the mission of Accessible Ohio. This concept for design prioritizes creating spaces and objects to be understandable, usable, and accessible to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, disability, or other factors. Accessible design and universal design work together to remove barriers and provide access for all. The concept of accessible design is informed by the ADA civil rights law and the 2010 standards for accessible design provided by the Department of Justice. Accessibility focuses on removing barriers and providing access to individuals with disabilities. Universal design considers equal access for all people, including the aging population, children and families, people with various learning styles, and individuals with disabilities. It is informed by specific principles and goals. Together, both design approaches help organizations to foster accessible and inclusive environments. Tanya, will you share an overview of what today's webinar includes?
I'd be happy to. First, we'll discuss the priority tool. This begins with an overview of the tool and how to use it. Next, we'll discuss step 1, which is developing accessibility goals. And then step 2, which is prioritizing your accessibility goals through a criteria rating exercise. These results are used to inform your game plan. We will discuss identifying responsible parties, how to fund a project, and setting timeframes. This will help develop your plan for moving forward with your goals. Shelly, let's start with an overview of the priority tool.
Absolutely, Tanya. The priority tool is a helpful way for an organization to identify and prioritize their accessibility goals. This tool helps uncover the aspects of your physical or built and digital or virtual environments that may have barriers to access for individuals with disabilities. With its two-step process, it helps an organization identify where to start and what steps to take next to continue their journey to being accessible and inclusive for all. To be most effective, we encourage you to utilize the game plan to organize how and when these goals will be achieved. Please note, the priority tool was not designed to take the place of a compliance tool. The accessibility and inclusion features listed are not a checklist to determine if an organization is accessible and ADA compliant. Instead, it is a way to continue the journey of accessibility and move beyond meeting the minimum guidelines to truly creating inclusive spaces for everyone. Tanya, would you share how to use the tool?
Step 1 of the tool includes developing a list of accessibility goals. To do this, review the accessibility features included in the tool while considering your organization's current accessibility features. The features are organized by the 4 Accessible Ohio priority areas of planning and awareness, navigation, experience, and personal care. Add accessibility features to the tool by selecting them from the drop-down or enter your own. Consider those features your organization has not yet implemented or has not implemented fully or would like to prioritize for consideration. The list of features included in this tool are not exhaustive. Also, there may be features listed that are not applicable to your organization. We would like to hear from the audience about accessibility features you have experienced, learned about during our playbook series, have implemented, or would like to implement. What would be on your priority list? Please enter your comments in the chat or raise your virtual hand. While our viewers are entering ideas, Shelly, will you share more about the work you have done, specifically consultations about accessibility features?
Great idea. I've consulted on a variety of accessibility features, and those included sensory spaces, sensory kits, accessible routes for an outdoor event, accessibility maps, and more. Tanya, would you like to share some accessibility features on which you've consulted?
Sure. I've consulted on a variety of topics as well. These include digital accessibility, accessible routes, wheelchair charging stations, and beacons. It's looking like our audience is quiet today. Oh, we do have one comment. Automatic doors in all buildings. That is a great suggestion and something that we like to see. Captioning. Another great suggestion. So your suggestions are accessibility features options listed on the priority tool. Oh, we've got another one, sensory room, making our website social media, etc., more accessible. Let's see. All great ideas. These suggestions may be options listed on the priority tool, and those that aren't, you could consider and choose to add to your list if you would like. Shelly?
Thanks. Thanks, Tanya. Let's share a story now about a local diner called Betty's Cafe that exists in a small town. Betty's is the sort of place where locals gather for a cup of coffee in the morning and a fish fry supper on Friday nights. Courtney, the daughter of a local family, has just moved back from college. While she was away, she acquired a disability affecting her mobility and her vision. She now uses a wheelchair for mobility and needs brighter light to see. Maggie, a close family friend and the manager of Betty's, realizes Courtney is unable to independently access the diner. Although a person using a wheelchair could enter the door, the narrow pathways make it difficult to get to the seating areas or the restroom. The seating in the diner was mainly booths and bar stools. Because of this layout, Courtney can't join her dad for a Saturday morning cup of coffee or her friends on Friday nights. Maggie and the owners of Betty's Cafe could use the priority tool and the resources available on the Accessible Ohio website to learn more about the accessibility features that apply to their environment. An Accessible Ohio specialist could guide them through the tool and discuss accessibility goals such as accessible routes, seating, lighting, and other features to add to the tool. Tanya, what are some other ways the tool could be used?
First, I'd like to highlight that priority tool can be utilized in a number of ways. You may decide to complete the tool one time in its entirety, or you may choose to complete a particular Accessible Ohio priority area on the tool that is of special interest. You may also decide to use the priority tool repeatedly over time as you continue on the journey towards accessibility. This may help identify new accessibility goals. An organization may choose to use it independently on their own to help identify accessibility and accessibility goals, or it may be used in conjunction with an Accessible Ohio specialist. The regional Accessible Ohio specialist can provide assistance and support with identifying and discussing the specific accessibility guidelines, incorporating best practices on accessibility and inclusion features listed. Now let's move on to step 2. After the features have been entered into the tool, proceed to step 2, prioritizing the accessibility goals. This tool uses 5 criteria to help prioritize the accessibility features. These include organizational commitment, which refers to the level of dedication and engagement the organization has towards the particular accessibility feature. Time to implement considers how much time will likely be needed to implement each accessibility feature and whether it can be implemented in the desired timeframe. Access to resources addresses the availability of needed resources to implement the accessibility feature. These resources may include budget, staff time, and more. Then impact refers to the difference the implementation of the accessibility will have on individuals with disabilities. This may refer to how many individuals will be affected and or how much the implementation will make a difference. Finally, ease to implement examines how available the knowledge, expertise, and experience needed to implement the accessibility feature is within the organization. We're going to discuss each of these criteria. Shelly, would you like to start with organizational commitment?
Of course. As with any new efforts, having buy-in and commitment of an organization can affect success. Buy-in can vary depending on several factors, including the size and the culture of the organization. There will be differences. The small diner, for instance, has few people to establish the buy-in, while a large entity may have a board of directors or a large staff. To assist in gaining support, communicate why the accessibility features matter and how they can benefit the community and the business. This rating on the priority tool can provide an indicator of the commitment you have within your organization. Another aspect to consider when prioritizing accessibility features is the time frame. This considers how much time is needed to carry out each goal and whether they can be implemented by the desired due date. This too will be dependent on each organization and accessibility feature. Different organizations have different resources that will affect the time frame. Other factors may include the availability of supplies and contractors if items need to be purchased or the project is outsourced. It may also differ based on the accessibility feature. For instance, modifying a policy may be accomplished much quicker than an item requiring a physical renovation. Tanya, what about resources?
This criterion is primarily focused on the organization's budget for the accessibility feature. Organizations may already have budgeted for their goals or need to develop a plan to fund them. To determine this, it's helpful to estimate the cost of the accessibility feature. This includes considering factors like materials, time, labor, existing resources, and more. It may also include the initial, ongoing, maintenance, and the training costs. An organization may have procedures for obtaining quotes and a procurement process to help estimate costs. Remember, as you're considering the budget, accessibility and inclusion features are positive investments in your organization. Another important criterion to consider is impact.
Yes, Tanya. The impact of an accessibility feature can vary and may be bigger than you initially think. At times, a feature may directly affect a specific group of individuals and result in creating access to an experience, goods, or services that is significant to them. At other times, and more likely when universal design concepts are applied, accessibility features have a wider impact. It impacts those who it is initially designed for and families with children, the aging population, people with various learning styles, and more. The positive impact the accessibility feature creates impacts the organization. In our story about Betty's Cafe, Courtney was impacted by not being able to access the cafe. Her family and friends were impacted by not being able to enjoy time at the cafe with her. In addition, others who needed accessible pathways and seating were impacted. For example, a guest who uses a walker or a parent pushing a stroller. Implementing these features can ultimately lead to an increase in customers, revenue, customer and employee satisfaction and loyalty, and community support. Tanya, can you share our final criterion?
Yes, the final criterion to consider on the priority tool is the ease to implement, which considers the organization's access to the knowledge, expertise, and experience necessary. For example, perhaps the organization has a maintenance person who can easily post signs according to the standards to meet accessibility guidelines. If the knowledge, expertise, or experience is not something the organizational staff have, the implementation of the accessibility feature may need more planning to become easily achievable. For example, the same organization's maintenance person may not have the skills, experience, and training to install an elevator. We have talked a lot about the various criteria to consider and discuss as you use our priority tool. I am going to explain how these inform step 2. Step 2 is to assign each accessibility feature selected a high, medium, or low rating for each criterion. For a high rating, use the number 3. For a medium rating, use a number 2. And for a low rating, use the number 1. For example, if there is strong organizational commitment or access to resources for a particular accessibility feature, assign a high rating of 3 for those criteria. As you're going through the tool, discuss each criterion with your team and arrive at a consensus rating for each. Rate all options at the same time, working across, not down the table. Then calculate the totals for each criterion to inform your game plan to help achieve the accessibility goals. Shelly, I think we need some coaching before we come up with the game plan.
You're right. Now that the priority tool has been completed, it's time to reflect on the features selected and the rating assigned to each criterion. This will be used in developing your game plan. Each organization will approach this in a way that is unique to them, but we will share a few approaches you might consider. For example, some organizations may notice some of the chosen accessibility features are readily attainable or easy to implement. These are the items that with little effort and minimal cost can have a big impact on the accessibility of a venue or its products, goods, and services. Other organizations may decide to focus the goals based on specific priority area. Perhaps ensuring all visitors can navigate the venue is the organization's main focus, meaning the accessibility features that are part of the navigation priority area would be the focus, such as parking, entering, and moving throughout the space. The organization may also approach the prioritization like our friends at Betty's Cafe. There may be a previously identified need. In their case, physical access to their diner had been identified. Organizations may choose a particular priority or elements because it is an area that has greater challenges, and your organization wants to improve the specific area. Organizations may also prioritize based on urgency and impact, considering what accessibility features will have the most significant impact on the accessibility and inclusivity of the organization. Talking with the disability community to gather feedback on accessibility measures can help identify what changes are most needed and will provide the best enhancement. It can also improve the community's perception of the organization. Maybe individuals with blindness or low vision cannot independently navigate through a public space. The organization identifies that, although audio beacons or visual interpreting may not be needed by most visitors, the impact for those who do will be substantial. An organization may also consider how it trains staff on accessibility features and relates those to the priority it places on creating a culture of inclusion. When staff see the impact these features can have on a customer's experience, this can help with buy-in and successful implementation. The ratings of the criteria for each feature may inform the organization's decision on their unique prioritization of the accessibility features. Remember, the tool isn't the decision maker, people are. After you have completed the tool, use this information to inform your game plan. And remember, Accessible Ohio specialists are available to assist you in completing the tool and developing your organization's game plan.
Shelly, that is a great reminder. I think this would be a good time to pause for questions. Julie Wood, the Accessible Ohio manager, will be joining us for the question and answer portions of this webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Also, we did receive some pre-submitted questions during the registration process for today's webinar. Julie, while we are waiting for questions in the chat, will you share a pre-submitted question?
Sure, thank you, Tanya. Hi, everybody, this is Julie. Before I share the first pre-submitted question, we just wanted to take the chance to reinforce or remind you that our new priority tool and game plan are not compliancy tools under the Americans with Disabilities Act. OOD itself as an agency is not an enforcement agency. The spirit of Accessible Ohio is to work in partnership with those organizations who are seeking our services to assist them with achieving their accessibility goals. And so we decided to create the priority tool and the game plan as resources that we can use with partners to help build awareness of all the accessibility features that can be incorporated into their environments, and then help our partners identify where they'd like to start, what their goals are, and establish a plan for how to achieve those goals. So they are not ADA compliancy tools. However, if you have that interest in assessing your environment from that perspective, there are some assessments you can look into. And I know, Shelly, you have one to share.
I do. Thanks, Julie. The one that I'd like to share is the New England ADA Center's checklist that can be helpful in identifying barriers in the physical environment. You may also contact Accessible Ohio, as our game plan might be able to be used alongside of that ADA checklist.
Thank you, Shelly. That checklist is certainly a helpful resource. It's based on the standards that we referenced earlier in the webinar from the Department of Justice. They're not an exhaustive list of everything that's in the standards, but it's a very helpful tool for public spaces. Our first pre-submitted question that I'd like to bring up during this section, we had a person mention the need for adult-sized changing tables in places where individuals who use wheelchairs may need assistance with dressing or to change clothing. So wanted to thank you for mentioning that to us. Wanted to share that in the session 5 on personal care of the Accessible Ohio Playbook, we did talk about accessible restrooms and we talked about universal changing stations. So wanted to let you know we do have that resource available if that's helpful. And then Tanya, you had an additional resource to share.
Yes, Julie. Accessible Ohio also has resources available on this topic. These resources included one on accessible restrooms and another on universal changing tables. The resources are available online and a link is available in the chat. If you have any additional questions on this topic, please contact the Accessible Ohio specialist in your region.
Thank you, Tanya. So we have a webinar, a resource, and we have AO specialists who can help with this topic if you would like to pursue integrating a universal changing station into your environment. And I'm checking the chat. I don't see any questions from the audience at this time. So I am going to turn it back to you two to continue with the webinar. We will have one more Q&A session at the end before we conclude. So I'll turn it back to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Now we would like to introduce the game plan. The game plan is your organization's plan for how to move forward with the goals you identified in the priority tool. This begins with general instructions on how to complete the plan, which includes organizing goals and identifying key information. We will talk about accessibility goals and ideas for how to prioritize them. Next, we'll continue with a brief discussion of each column in the game plan, which includes responsible parties, how to fund, and desired timeframe. Shelly, can you start off by giving us an introduction to the general instructions for the game plan?
Sure. After you've completed the priority tool, you'll begin to populate the game plan based on the results of the tool. The plan is designed for organizations to identify short, medium, and long-term goals if they wish. Goals that can be accomplished in a few weeks to a few months or less are considered short-term accessibility goals. Those that can be accomplished in a few months to less than a year are medium-term accessibility goals. And those that can be accomplished over an extended period of time, for example, more than a year to several years, are long-term accessibility goals. Once you've selected your goals in the game plan, you can populate the provided columns to identify helpful information for implementing your goals. These include responsible parties, how to fund, and desired timeframe to accomplish. We would like to share a broad overview and to discuss each of these columns in some detail. Tanya, would you get us started with this?
Yes. On the screen is the layout of the game plan, highlighting the section used for the short-term accessibility goals. There are columns for a responsible party, how to fund the goal, and the desired timeframe. The form is the same for the medium-term and long-term accessibility goals. We're going to explain as we go along. The first column in the game plan table is where the accessibility goals are placed once they are identified using the priority tool. Organizations can use the criteria ratings in the way that works best for them to impact the decision-making process for the game plan. The criteria ratings and totals for each accessibility feature can help inform where each accessibility goal best fits. Those with high ratings likely fit best into the short-term accessibility goal portion of the game plan table. Those with mid-number ratings will likely fall in the medium-term ones. And finally, those with low ratings may most likely be long-term accessibility goals. Once the accessibility goals are populated in the game plan table, use the columns to identify the next steps to implementing them. These include inserting information for responsible parties, how to fund, and the desired timeframe. Let's share why we included these, beginning with the column for responsible parties.
Sure, Tanya. It's important to assign responsibility for initiating the project, tracking progress, and ensuring the project remains on target. This responsibility may be assigned to one person, or depending on the accessibility goal and your organization, this may need to be multiple people or even a team. Some projects will involve hiring contracted workers, and they will need a designated point person. Regardless of how this looks for your organization, assigning responsibility is key for ensuring accessibility goals are met. The next area to address is how to fund the accessibility goal. Depending on the cost of the feature, this may or may not be a concern. So, reflecting back to the priority tool, resource ratings will provide information for each feature on the ability to implement due to the budget. This may be a no to low cost item, one for which the organization has funding, or an accessibility feature that resources have yet to be allocated and are currently not available. For those accessibility projects and items with a cost, you may want to consider various approaches to help fund them. A best practice is to create a budget for accessibility. This can be utilized for workplace accommodations and overall accessibility for aspects of the business. A budget can help streamline the process for purchasing and implementing solutions, making it more efficient. Tanya, would you share other options to help with funding with our audience?
Of course. Working with your organization to develop a plan to fund a project has some options. We would like to discuss some additional ways to plan for funding. These include using tax incentives, grants, and fundraising. It is helpful to talk with your financial and tax professionals about the tax incentives available for entities who make changes to create more accessible environments. There are two main tax incentives an organization may wish to explore further. The first is the Disabled Access Credit. This is a credit for small businesses who incur costs associated with providing access to persons with disabilities. This credit can be taken each year there are expenses. The second is the Barrier Removal Tax Deduction. This is a deduction related to the removal of architectural and transportation barriers related to the mobility of individuals with disabilities. The deduction is a maximum of $15,000 a year for qualified expenses that normally must be capitalized. One of the services Accessible Ohio provides is assisting in identifying grants. There are federal, state, and local grants available specifically for accessibility features. There are also private grants businesses and organizations offer. These grants have different requirements and different timelines for applying. We have had a business apply for a grant and obtain funding for their project. Fundraising is another way entities can obtain funding. Fundraising can be initiated and run by an entity on their own or with the assistance of an organization or consultant. Shelly, the final bit of information to populate into the game plan is about the desired time frame.
Correct. The time frame can identify your desired date for implementing the goal or could indicate a time frame such as 3 weeks, several months, or multiple years. Determining a time frame can be influenced by many factors. The size of the project and the way it will be funded can impact how long it will take and the date the project may be completed by. Larger projects may need to be broken down into smaller components with several dates assigned to stay on target for completion. This date should be realistic and can be flexible in some cases. However, if the date is for something time sensitive, like providing accessible seating at an advertised temporary event, it's more finite.
Shelly, once the columns of each accessibility goal are filled in, the game plan is complete. Now it's time to take action. We have some ideas to help you get started and then keep taking steps to complete each goal in your plan. First, the game plan is intended to provide a simple and general plan for achieving your accessibility goals. However, some of these goals will be more involved, and organizations may wish to combine this information into existing project management tools to organize the steps along the way. Next, there's a strategy the organization can use to implement the accessibility goals identified. The game plan can be revisited periodically to help keep the organization on track to meet its goals. And the goals listed may need to be reassessed if something changes. And that's okay too. Finally, regardless of how you may have approached this process, you may wish to complete the priority tool and game plan periodically, like once every 6 months, every year, or every couple of years. The game plan outlines the plan to implement the accessibility goals. It's important to use it and not to file it away and forget about it. Imagine how satisfying it will be to not only check off accessibility goals as they are implemented, but to know how the organization is making a difference and being more accessible and inclusive. Shelly, will you share how Accessible Ohio can be a resource to Ohio's businesses, communities, venues, and attractions?
Sure, Tanya. There are 3 main ways we are providing services to support our partners in achieving their accessibility goals. Through a consultation, an Accessible Ohio specialist will work one-on-one with an organization to learn about their accessibility goals and provide resources and information on best practices related to accessibility, inclusivity, and universal design. We also partner with employers who have specific goals and projects related to accessibility, disability inclusion, and responsibilities under Title I of the ADA to provide reasonable accommodations for employees and candidates with disabilities. These consults include sharing information about grants and funding sources available for partners to consider when making more costly accessibility enhancements.
Shelly, we also provide education through in-person presentations and monthly webinars. Our monthly webinars are recorded and archived in our on-demand library so they can be accessed anytime. As we wrap up this webinar series for this year, we would like to hear from you about what topics about accessibility and inclusion you are interested in learning more about. So if you could please answer in the chat. And while you're putting your ideas in the chat, I can share that we also develop helpful resources with information on a variety of topics to reference and become more aware of accessibility concepts and practices. These are located in the resource check section of the Accessible Ohio webpage and organized alphabetically. Let's see if we have any ideas in the chat. I'm not seeing any ideas, So we'd like to now open it up to the audience to ask any questions you may have. You can do so by raising your virtual hand or entering questions into the chat. Julie is going to be joining us again and is going to start with a pre-submitted question.
Thank you, Tanya, and hello again, everyone. This is Julie. Our first pre-submitted question for this section is asking if Accessible Ohio can consult with big festivals. Yes, we can consult with any business, community, venue, or attraction who's wishing to partner with us to focus on their accessibility goals. And Tanya, would you like to share an experience you had with a partner?
Yes, we have consulted with both large and small organizations, including temporary festivals. I've had the pleasure of consulting with a large festival, providing resources to assist them in implementing a new accessibility map on their website and a universal changing station. They have goals for the future, and we will be looking forward to working together over the next few years as they continue to strive for increased accessibility.
Thank you for sharing. I know that's a great partnership that we have, Tanya, so thank you for telling us a little bit about that. The next question that we have is asking about industry certifications, and we weren't sure exactly what types of industry certifications you were inquiring about, so we have a few that we can share with you. There is a certification for Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. There's a certification program, so if you have an interest in that, it does cover Title I and Title II and III. Title I is the employment title, and then Title II and III are for the public sector. So we could certainly connect you with that information. We have seen that there are certifications some organizations pursue related to sensory inclusion. So we'd be happy to talk with you further about what specifically you might be looking for in your environment to see what resources we could find. And then Shelly, I know that you had one more to share.
I do. Thanks, Julie. I'd like to add that the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, or IAAP, also offers several accessibility certifications, and those range from website accessibility certification to the certification for accessibility in the built environment. So
thank you, Shelly, for pointing that out, because it's helpful to remember that accessibility touches both the physical built environment, but also the digital virtual environment. And we're doing so much more these days in the virtual and digital spaces. So thank you for touching on that. Check the chat one more time. I don't see any hands raised and I don't see any questions in the chat. So we do appreciate your participation and we appreciate the pre-submitted questions. Shelly, I'll turn it back over to you to wrap up today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We enjoyed sharing Accessible Ohio's priority tool and game plan with you. We discussed how to use the priority tool to identify and prioritize accessibility goals. We then explored how to use the game plan to help organizations move forward and take steps to complete the accessibility goals identified in the priority tool. And remember, you have a partner in this process. Your Accessible Ohio specialist is available to meet with you to listen to your needs, provide resources, and support you along the way in achieving our combined mission to empower everyone to experience all our great state has to offer in an equitable way. Please contact the Accessible Ohio specialist in your region to start a partnership with us. Our contact information is on our webpage, and a link is being provided in the chat area for your convenience. I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for your continued interest in our webinars.